This is Elizabeth Holmes. In 2015, she was the youngest and wealthiest self-made female billionaire in the United States. And that sounds good to me. My name's Christopher Claflin and I'm an entrepreneur. You might be an entrepreneur, chances are you're interested in it if you're watching this video. But this episode is a cautionary tale on how not to be an entrepreneur. Meet Elizabeth Holmes. Her company, Theranos, was valued at over $9 billion. Her name appeared on 18 US patents and 66 foreign patents. She was on the cover of magazines. She was hailed as the female Steve Jobs of biotech in Silicon Valley. She was the youngest and most impressive up-and-coming entrepreneur in the world, and to make everything better, she was a woman. Because at that time, people were just starting to get excited about diversity. No matter how you slice it, the Stanford dropout was hailed as a genius. And it was all a lie. Holmes' company had raised money and gotten attention on the idea that this machine could perform up to 30 blood tests for patients on a blood sample 1/10 the size required for typical blood work. They called this machine Edison. Edison was supposed to use micro capsules of blood to run up to 30 tests on patients to detect everything from high cholesterol to cancer. And Holmes had successfully raised $700 million from investors, but all of their investment came with a catch. Money could be invested in Theranos under the condition that the company not reveal how their technology worked. And Holmes was to maintain full control over everything that went on within her company. And this enabled her to eventually lie to and defraud investors. It allowed her to successfully perpetuate her lie much longer than she otherwise would have been able to. Because Edison, the machine that was supposed to be able to run all of these complex blood tests on a tiny little sample of blood, it didn't work. Complex internal mechanisms and the need to centrifuge blood, spin it at high rates of speed to separate the particles, caused internal chaos within the machine. Pieces broke, glass shattered, blood was spattered everywhere inside of these things, and sadly the development and engineering teams were on the right track to making things work. It's not like everybody was involved in this big conspiracy. They were working on the tech. It's just that the tech wasn't anywhere close to where Elizabeth Holmes had led the media, investors, and the world to believe. Now, the thing about Edison is when it did work, results were spotty and inaccurate. So even though they were making progress in the right direction, it was far from being able to be released to the public. But that didn't stop Holmes from continuing to raise capital and work on this image that was building around her. Holmes had an image and reputation that was starting to precede her. And it's ultimately what got her and her company in trouble. Because rather than keeping her head down and working on the problems within her company, Elizabeth Holmes got caught up in her image, the respect that she was getting, the fascination with the tech that she had claimed to have developed. And it got her and her company, which could have been successful, into a pit that they couldn't crawl out of. Things started to spiral when Theranos made a partnership with Walgreens. Theranos partnered with Walgreens, allowing customers to come in and have blood tests taken with Edison, which eventually was supposed to be a machine that people could have in their homes. But for this first rollout, people had to go into Walgreens, get their finger pricked, get their drop of blood, Edison would test it, and then send them the results. The only problem was Edison wasn't at any of these locations, and people were getting their blood drawn as they normally would when they just went to the doctor, a whole vial full of blood, rather than this little thimbleful of blood that Theranos was famous for, that they claimed they could run all these tests on. Many of the samples that were taken were sent to third-party labs that did the analysis and sent back reports, and some of them were done by Theranos. And many of the reports that Theranos sent back to patients were allegedly completely fabricated. So, not long after this, the Securities and Exchange Commission and the FDA launched investigations against the company. And Holmes was charged with fraud in 2018. So flash forward 4 years later, Holmes is on trial and she's recently been charged with 4 out of 11 charges. She could face up to 20 years in prison, but it hasn't affected her lifestyle, and this is where things get kind of interesting. During the time she was awaiting her trial, it was reported that Holmes had been living in this $135 million Silicon Valley estate. Now, what's really strange about this story is something that I alluded to earlier. Holmes wasn't necessarily actively defrauding investors intentionally. This is actually a story of fake it till you make it on the biggest scale that we've ever seen somebody fake it and never make it. She'd put together a really impressive board. She'd built a team of brilliant scientists and engineers. They had a product. They had built Edison. It just didn't work all the time, and when it did work, it didn't work very well. But that's not to say they couldn't get it to the point that it could be what they claimed it was going to be. The Theranos campus was state of the art. The company and Elizabeth Holmes could have changed the world despite the fact that she was a fraud. She was fraudstering her way to being legitimate. But in the end, it almost seemed like she got so caught up in this female Steve Jobs image and all the love she was getting from the media and the press that became her priority, to maintain and work on that image rather than focus on making sure that Edison and Theranos became the successful company that they claimed to already be. They really might have been able to pull it off. But that's not even the most interesting part about all of this, because while Elizabeth Holmes might have had the opportunity to take a different path in life and make all of this work, she didn't. And it's interesting because her father was associated with one of the biggest frauds in American history himself. You see, the media, always starving for a sensational story, picked up Holmes and started promoting her as this self-made female billionaire. But she wasn't self-made at all. She came from big money, big Enron money. Her father was Charles Holmes IV. He was the vice president at Enron, and that's a whole nother story in and of itself. And this is the family that Elizabeth Holmes was born into. So she came from money, and she had a lot of connections. Her father had a lot of connections. And despite this, nobody who invested in her company or joined her board or joined the team questioned any of her motives. And it's probably because they were building a real product. But along the way, she couldn't escape her past and started going down the same path that her father did with Enron. Slightly different story, but essentially the same outcome. So here we are in 2022. Holmes has been found guilty on 4 of 11 charges, and the charges that Holmes has been found guilty of include 1 count of conspiracy to defraud investors and 3 wire frauds tied to a handful of investors, and she could face up to 20 years in prison, as well as a fine of $250,000 per charge, which is why it makes you think, why was she spending all of her money in this estate during her trial, knowing that she's going to have to pay all this money back? There does seem to be this group running around in Silicon Valley, parts of Washington, where the rules just don't apply. And you just keep living like a baller, free of guilt, regardless of all the damage and destruction that you've caused. Must be nice. Anyway, this is an important reminder that fake it till you make it isn't always the best path forward for entrepreneurs. It's great to have a dream and work towards it, something that you can scale, something that's hyper scalable, something that can change the world. But when money or clout and fame become the only things that matter, and you lose sight of everything else, you're heading for a crash. Holmes drank her own Kool-Aid. Investors believed the hype, and in reality, there really wasn't much there. So next time you feel like your business or your startup really isn't going anywhere, isn't significant enough, isn't big enough, just remember that whatever you've built is probably more real and has more value that it's brought to the marketplace than the $9 billion unicorn of the mid-2010s, Theranos. Thanks so much for watching. My name is Christopher Claflin, and if your new startup or existing business needs a web-based application, mobile application, or website designed or built or both, reach out to us at CompleteWebLaunch.com. We'll take really good care of you. See you next time. Bye.